This is going to be a content-heavy presentation. It's going to be it's going to be a little bit more teacherly, and I hope you don't feel that I'm patronizing you. But it's just that, you know, when I was in the university, nobody ever taught me anything about natural law. How many of you, when you were, let's say, undergraduates, if you can remember something that long ago, how many of you were ever given a serious and sympathetic explanation of natural law, as other than, say, just a mention of something that people believed a long time ago? Any hands? Well, I saw 1, 2, 3. All right, just a handful. Well, that was what it is for me. So I want to cover a lot of things. Now, for this reason, these are information-heavy slides. I'm going to be moving at about 180 miles an hour. I'm going to be speaking at that rate of speed that they always tell speakers you should never use. and I'm going to try to get to not use up my whole hour and a half doing the slideshow so that we can have some time for Q&A. You'll also have to forgive me. This is a high-tech presentation. I don't usually do that either. And I hope that the slides will advance forward and that the sound really works like it's supposed to. Natural law is deeply rooted in the Western tradition. In American history in particular, we know this. Consider several famous incidents. When the American colonists went to war for independence from England, they justified their cause on the basis of what? The laws of nature and nature's God, they said. And they claimed that this gave them inalienable natural rights. When Abraham Lincoln debated slavery with Frederick Douglass, the basis of his argument was that this deplorable institution was an offense against the same principles of natural justice to which Americans had pledged themselves in that aspirational document, the Declaration of Independence. When Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter against racial segregation and Jim Crow laws, he too based his appeal on the natural law. And interestingly, people forget this, he gave a lot of attention to the classical natural law thinker Thomas Aquinas. When the Nazi war criminals defended themselves against charges brought against them on grounds that law is nothing but the command of one's own government and that they were only following orders, the Nuremberg Tribunal disagreed, holding that natural law provides a rational standard by which the laws of any country may be judged. But what is the natural law? I'm on the wrong slide here. There we go. When people ask, they may have a lot of different questions in mind. As I indicate here on this slide, sometimes they're asking about the natural law per se. What do you mean, natural law? Sometimes they're asking about the natural law tradition. It's a history of ideas question. Sometimes about natural law theory, or perhaps a particular natural law theory. There is more than one theoretical approach to it. Sometimes they're asking about the content of the natural law. What does it say? What does it say is right or wrong according to the natural law? What is good? What is evil? Sometimes in law, especially in law schools, they're asking about the jurisprudential views associated with natural law with the natural law tradition. And sometimes they're just asking about the term natural law. Why do you call it natural? In what sense? What do you mean by nature? Why do you call it law? Is it really a law? So I'm going to take each of these points in turn. Now, the natural law per se is the foundational principles of right and wrong that are both, let's say, right for all and at some level known for all, taken either by themselves, that's the first use of the term natural law. Sometimes people are just speaking of these moral basics, or else, second sense of the term, taken together with their more or less obvious, more or less remote implications. Now, not all of the corollaries of the natural law are obvious. Some of its remote implications may be recognized only by those few who have the requisite experience and acuteness and discernment. So when I say the basics are things that are not only right for all, but at some level known to all, I'm not saying the same thing about all of the details. What about the natural law tradition, then? The natural law tradition is the ancient and continuing project. It's ongoing, of disentangling the law written on the heart, that's St. Paul's expression for the natural law, from the evasions and subterfuges of men. The labor of disentanglement, I'd like to say, is hardest when we're dealing with the remote implications of the natural law. It's easiest when we're dealing with the more proximate, the nearer corollaries. But notice that even our excuses betray some knowledge of the natural law. When somebody makes excuses, that doesn't mean that he's ignorant. The only way to rationalize breaking a rule is to appeal in a dishonest way to the rule itself. You might say that rationalization is the homage paid by sin to guilty knowledge. And ultimately, even these excuses that we develop don't really work. The Nazis told themselves, for instance, that they weren't really murdering, they weren't really violating the precept against deliberately taking innocent life, because the Jews were merely animals and were guilty anyway. Now, that was a lie, but we also know from the testimony of Nazi psychiatrists that the death camp soldiers suffered worse symptoms because of their mistreatment of the Jews than combat soldiers, and that they had nightmares in which their victims accused them. So deep down they must have known that the excuses that they were giving to themselves about the alleged non-humanity, animality, and the alleged guilt of the Jews were wrong. A natural law theory is an explanation of the relations among goods, virtues, formal norms, and everyday moral rules, such as the good of friendship, the virtue of courage, the formal norm of treating equals equally, the everyday rule don't steal. Natural law theories also explore some other things too, a lot of other things. They explore things like how we know the natural law, how our knowledge of it is clarified or obscured, how its content is rooted in our nature, how its authority is rooted in God. Specialized branches of applied natural law theory consider the natural foundations of particular human institutions, such as marriage, family, government. Just war theory might be thought of as the natural law of war. They also think about the natural law basis of particular human practices, such as lawmaking, teaching, doctoring, raising children, about which we heard so eloquently last night from Dr. Morse. The classical summary of the content of the natural law is the next thing that I'd like to talk about. This is the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. This is, I don't mean that everybody's read the Bible or read this in the Bible, but rather that the Decalogue, which we find in the Bible, happens to be a superlative summary of what the natural law, not just the revealed law, includes. Now, this statement that I make can be misunderstood, because I'm not just referring to the explicit words of the Decalogue as we find them in Scripture. Either, let's think about it this way. People in every time and place, whether or not they've ever heard of the Old Testament, recognize that it's good to honor parents, it's wrong to commit adultery, and so on, even though they may fudge the details and even though they may not live up to them. And when I call the Decalogue a good summary of the natural law, I'm considering it along with what it presupposes, what it implies, and what it suggests. The prohibition of adultery, for example, presupposes the procreative partnership called marriage. It implies that there is something sacred about it, and it suggests a broader norm of sexual purity, of which faithfulness to your spouse is merely the most conspicuous and perhaps important example. The natural law tradition, then, is associated with the jurisprudential view. I said this is what people in law schools are especially interested in. The jurisprudential view that laws that violate the foundational principles of right and wrong are not laws in the strict sense. In some thin sense, sure, they're laws, they're enactments. But if by a law you mean something that binds you in conscience, in that strict sense, they're not laws, they're something more like enacted frauds, passing themselves off as laws, but that aren't. They're abuses of governmental authority which cannot in themselves command the assent of conscience. That's why in Article 96, Question 96 of the Treatise on Law, which was part of your readings, Article 4, St. Thomas considers the moral grounds of disobedience to an unjust law. And he says that if it's an unjust law, strictly speaking, it's not a law at all. He says unjust enactments of certain kinds may be disobeyed, except perhaps where disobedience would be even more harmful than the unjust law itself. But there are some other unjust enactments, such as commands to commit murder, theft, blasphemy, which must be disobeyed. It's not may be disobeyed. He says you must disobey them. And it doesn't matter what the penalty is. There are no exceptions, even if the penalty for disobedience would be death. Natural law, finally I said, how is it law? How is it natural? Natural law is called law because it has the qualities of all law. Now, I'm going to give a more elaborate explanation a little bit later of what I mean by the qualities of all law, so I'm just brushing over that point right now. It's called natural law, natural though, because it's built into the design of human nature, more about that later too, and woven into the fabric of the normal human mind, into the deep structure of practical reason. Also because it's about what really is. We often use the word nature to express moral reality. The natural law is a moral realist theory. It holds that the moral laws are part of the facts of the universe. We'll come back to these points too. So for now, suffice it to say that when I remark that the natural law is about what really is, I mean that a rule like the prohibition of murder reflects not just a mere illusion or projection of our own minds, but genuine knowledge about reality. It expresses the actual moral character of a certain kind of act. Now, even this talk, I was invited to speak about the classical natural law tradition, and there are lots of non-classical theories. As a matter of fact, the framers of the American Constitution, the founders of the American Republic, were primarily influenced by non-classical rather than classical theories of natural law, although they had one foot in the classical tradition too. So there was some continuity there. So what distinguishes the classical tradition? Now, even the non-classical theories of natural law agree about the content of the moral basics that I was talking about before. There's no mystery about things like honoring your parents or not cheating, never deliberately taking innocent human life. But even so, natural lawyers of different stripes explore this commonly agreed upon content in different ways. The classical view, what I'm calling the classical view, is a quote-unquote thick view, and it's the mainstream of the tradition. Now, among those who speak about natural law, who use the expression natural law, we find thinkers of all sorts of backgrounds. We find, among others, pagans, Christians, Jews, and others. Thinkers like Aristotle, thinkers like Marcus Tullius Cicero, St. Thomas Aquinas are congenial to what I'm calling the thick view. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes are hostile to what I'm calling the thick view. Their view of natural law is a thin view. Thinkers like John Locke are ambivalent about it. They've got one foot in each camp. They blow in some ways warm, but in other ways cold. Now, what do I mean by a thick view? How is the thick view thick? I call the classical approaches thick because they all weave together at least 4 different sources of moral knowledge, or as I like to say, 4 witnesses. This is this business about the 4 witnesses is my own summary, but I'm trying to be faithful to what the classical approaches all have in common, rather than just making up my own theory out of thin air. The first witness. I always have to remember that this has to be in line of sight here. Can you help with the keyboard, perhaps? Thank you. I may say page down from time to time, and I'd appreciate it if you'd just do that, and then I won't have to worry about this anymore. Thanks. The first witness is something that the classical thinkers called sundaresis. I sometimes say synderesis, which is how it looks in English, and I sometimes say sundaresis because that Y is really a transliteration of an upsilon. But nobody except me ever says sundaresis, and so I try to remember and say synderesis. Synderesis is that by which the mind spontaneously recognizes the truth of those moral basics that I was talking about, the truth of the foundational principles of right and wrong. We can call synderesis, this is more comfortable, I think, deep conscience, to distinguish it from conscientia, surface conscience, that by which the mind judges actions by comparing them to principles that are already known. This is an interesting thing. The classical natural law thinkers distinguished between conscientia and synderesis when they understood what we call conscience as being 2 things, not 1. We've lost that distinction today mostly, and we think of conscience as one thing, but they thought of it as these two things. Now, the point to remember about deep conscience is that there are certain moral basics that everyone really knows. In fact, that we can't not know. To say that we can't not know them doesn't imply that moral teaching is unimportant. It's very important. What it does imply to say that we can't not know them is that when moral teaching does work, the way that it works is that it interacts with something that is already there, even if only latent and undeveloped. Even the murderer knows the wrong of murder. Even the supposed atheist knows the wrong of mocking God. Even the adulterer the wrong of adultery. On this view, there are no real moral skeptics all the way down. Supposed skeptics are playing make-believe, and they're doing it rather badly. Page down, please. The second witness is, let's call it the sheer designedness of human beings. We're not just a blooming, buzzing confusion. And you say, well, why is this a source of moral knowledge? Because the recognition of our designedness does at least three things for moral knowledge. First, it vindicates the previous consideration that was deep conscience. Why? Well, after all, if deep conscience were merely a meaningless and purposeless leftover of a process that did not have us in mind, then why listen to it? Second, our designedness confirms that we have duties not only to neighbor, but also to the designer himself, to the uncreated good in whom the goods of creation are rooted. Third, the fact of our designedness informs us that just as deep conscience is designed, I was talking about that, well, so the rest of us is designed. All of our features form part of a pattern. We are a canvas for this designer's purposes. Page down, please. This brings us to the third witness, which is the actual features of our design. Okay, we were talking about the sheer fact that we're designed, but what are the features? Those are morally important too, along with the purposes and meanings embedded in them. The classical view is a teleological view. By the way, this is what Thomas Aquinas has in mind when he speaks of natural inclinations. It's an expression that's often misunderstood. He's not referring to just desires that we may happen to have or desires that we may happen to have even been born with, which may be disordered or pathological. After all, you might be born with a heart murmur or with one leg shorter than the other or something like that, and we don't say that that corresponds to our natural design. Rather, the natural inclinations are the inclinations that are reflective of how we were designed to function. Some of our design features show up at the individual level, such as the fact that we are persons. We are not just things. We are who's and not just what's. Some of our design features show up at the level of the species, such as the fact that there are two kinds of us, and each sex needs the other to be balanced and to be complete. Any way of life that denies sexual complementarity is asking for trouble. Some of our design features show up at both the individual level and the species level. For example, the fact that man is a being who desires to know, and wonder is not just a solitary quest, but requires friendship, both personal friendship and communal friendship. Design features like these establish conditions for human flourishing that would not have been deducible just from the fact that in some thin sense we're rational. What they require us to recognize is the fine grain, the actual texture of our personal, embodied, rational being. And our institutions had better not stifle any of our design features, or we're going to have problems. Page down, please. That brings me to the fourth consideration, the fourth home truth, I'll call it, that actions have natural consequences. Natural law theory is not consequentialist in thinking that this is the only consideration, or that if you could get rid of the consequence, the act would be okay. But there is room for considering consequences too. As the Roman poet Horace wrote, you may drive out nature with a pitchfork, but it always returns. And the problem is that it may return angry if you're beating it. Natural consequences teach us things. They are, you might say, the witness of last resort, the one that kicks in when the others are ignored. If you ignore conscience, if you ignore the fact of your design or the details of your design, you're going to be kicked. nature is going to kick back at you having been cut. Those who cut themselves bleed. Those who betray their friends are betrayed by their friends. Those who live by knives die by knives. Those who abandon their children have no one to comfort them when they are old. Those who travel from bed to bed lose the capacity, the very capacity for romantic intimacy and trust. Those who try to make themselves morally stupid inevitably end up stupider than they had intended. So these consequences include not just physical consequences like disease. They include social consequences. They even include noetic consequences, consequences having to do with the shape of our knowledge. Page down, please. Now, isn't it true that what we've been talking about today so far is barely intelligible to people, maybe not even intelligible to them? The concept of natural law has been virtually forgotten in contemporary society. Yes, there's some natural rootedness. I say that you can't not know certain things, but the theory is not one of those things that you can't not know. And the theory has been forgotten. The concept of natural law has been virtually forgotten, and if remembered at all, is usually misunderstood. When people hear the expression natural law, they often think of things like the law of gravity that makes rocks fall, the law of the jungle that makes lions eat lambs.
It's a natural law. Physics tells us that for every action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction. They hate us, we hate them, they hate us back. So, here we are, victims of mathematics.
Victims of mathematics, yes. Well, that little sound clip from Babylon 5 is not what we're talking about here. Law is addressed to a free and rational being, law in the strict sense. When rocks fall, they're merely responding to physical forces. When lions eat lambs, they're merely following instincts. They aren't thinking to themselves, this is the law. I am rationally obligated to conform my will to it. Please. Let's be more systematic. I said earlier that natural law really is law because it has the qualities of all law. Well, what are these qualities in your readings? In question 90, Articles 1 through 4. In Article 1, he begins with the common sense understanding that law, everybody sort of knows this, and he dialectically opens up or unpacks the idea over the next four articles, that law is a rule and measure of human action, of distinctively human action. It's a rule in the sense that it commands us what to do. It's a measure in the sense that it's a standard by which action can be evaluated. And we're talking about human action, the action of free and rational beings, not the mere behavior of rocks or lions or dogs. Page down, please. But St. Thomas doesn't stop with this common sense idea that a law is a rule and measure of human action. As I say, he clarifies and expands it. In order to do that, he poses 4 questions in these 4 articles. By putting the answers to the 4 questions together, what we end up with is the more complete 4-part definition of law that has attained a sort of a canonical position in the tradition. I'm not saying that there is no natural lawyer of any theory or any stripe who might not want to define law differently, but this is the sort of axis. True law turns out to be, number 1, an ordinance of reason. Number 2, for the common good. Number 3, made by him who has care of the community. And number 4, promulgated. So let's talk about each of these 4 elements in turn. Page down, please. To say that law is an ordinance of reason is to say that it isn't a mere whim or a naked exercise of power, but something that the mind can recognize as right. Now, why is that? Remember, law is a rule and measure of human action. A rule and measure of something has to take into account the kind of thing that it is ruling and measuring. Human action is action for a reason. We act for reasons, as a matter of fact, even when we act for bad reasons, don't we? Unless the law appeals to our minds, therefore, it couldn't serve as a rule and measure for distinctively human action. Page down, please. To say that law is for the common good is to say that it isn't there to serve the selfish interests of private parties, but the well-being of all. All human action is for the sake of some good. The purpose of law, as distinct from just the judgments of my own prudence, is the common good, because it rules and measures the actions of not just one person, but the whole community. Page down, please. To clarify this idea, You know, I had a student once come to me after one of my classes. I had been talking about the American founders who talked about the public interest, the common good, and she said, "What do you mean common good? I've never heard this expression before. None of my teachers have ever used it. I've always been taught that what we should always do is pursue our self-interest, and that's what politics is all about." So this is something that can be startling to people. An example of the common good is the defense of the Commonwealth. If anyone is defended, everyone is defended. Even more important common goods include justice, include partnership and virtue. It isn't even possible to take some virtue away from one person to give more to another. So our interests really in this respect cannot conflict. Still another common good is the integrity of human nature itself, which you might think, well, how can you damage that? You can. Many misguided people today, attempts have been made to produce human-pig chimeras, for instance. I can give you details if you're interested. No, of course, you know, if you have the idea of the common good, someone might say, but then how could sacrifice ever be justified? You must sacrifice for the common good. Somebody might say, but isn't that contrary to my individual good? Well, not necessarily, because one of the deepest facts about human nature is that we are social beings. We are not made to live alone. Could you really say that you were flourishing, that you were experiencing your full good in every dimension if all those whom you loved were suffering and you wouldn't lift a finger to help them? Would you really be doing yourself a favor if you said, well, they can go die, every man for himself? Next, please. To say that law is made by him who has care of the community is to say that it can't be made by private parties who are responsible only for taking care of their own good. It has to be made by those who are responsible for the common good. I can't make traffic laws, for instance. Now, the singular him in this phrase may lead you to think that St. Thomas is thinking of only one person, that, you know, that he thinks that we have to have an absolute monarchy. No, nothing of the sort. He does make clear elsewhere that the care of the community may also belong to a group of people, like the ruling assembly of a republic, and he prefers, as a matter of fact, what he calls a free community, in which the people do have both the moral capacity and the legal authority to make their own laws. So a good paraphrase for this element of the definition might be made by those who have care of the community, or better yet, made by legitimate public authority. Next, please. To say that law must be promulgated is, of course, to say that it must be made known. How could an enactment serve as a rule and measure of human action if nobody knew what it was? Thomas Aquinas is pulled over by a policeman. He says, "You've broken the speeding laws." Thomas Aquinas says, "I was only doing 45. The cop says, "Yeah, but the speed limit here is 25. He says, "How can that be? The sign over there says 45. He says, "It's a secret speed limit." Now, would Thomas Aquinas say, "Oh, well, if it's a secret speed limit, it's not a good speed limit. If it's a secret law, it's not a good law"? No. What he would say is, if it's a secret law, it isn't really a law. To be truly a law, it has to be promulgated. This is merely an enacted fraud. It is to quote St. Augustine, whom he actually quotes in this context, it is an act of violence. Now, here's something to think about. I just throw this out, maybe for discussion later. If government makes so many regulations that even though they're published somewhere in a Federal Register or in some such place, nevertheless, there are far too many for anyone to keep track of, can they be said to be truly promulgated? Next, please. Now, it's obvious that a human law can be an ordinance of reason, but after all, this is a talk about the natural law. A human law can be an ordinance of reason for the common good made by legitimate authority and promulgated, but do moral rules satisfy those four conditions? Are they really law? Well, let's consider an example. How about the moral rule, "Thou shalt not murder," or to expand that, never directly take innocent human life, no exceptions. Is it an ordinance of reason? Sure, the prohibition of murder is not just an arbitrary whim. It is something that the mind can recognize as right. Is it for the common good? Yes, it serves not a special interest, but the good of all. Is it made by him who has care of the community? Yes, its author has care of the universe. He created it. Is it promulgated? Yes, it isn't a secret rule, because this creator has so arranged his creation that every rational being knows about it. It's inscribed in the deep structure, as I say, of our moral intellect. Deep down, as I've said, that's why even the wrongdoer knows what the basics are that he's violating, and that's why they make excuses for themselves. Next, please. So natural law is law. But how is it natural? Some might even say that it isn't natural. Some people do say that it isn't natural. Listen to the way that we talk. The judge says, defendant, you've been convicted of theft. A grave violation not only of, where are we, New Jersey law, but of natural law. What have you got to say for yourself? The thief says, well, judge, how can you blame me? I needed the money, see? And I saw a chance to get it, that's all. I was just doing what comes naturally. Is that an appeal to the natural law? Maybe in a perverse way it is. Another example of the thief's way of thinking, give me the next slide please. Consider the immortal words of the Bloodhound Gang and their hit song, The Bad Touch. In case you aren't familiar with this wonderful group, the song is from the aptly titled album, Hooray for Boobies. This semester, I played this for my undergraduate natural law class. The undergraduates were really grooving on this. You know, they thought this is great. And this is just how they think. It wasn't just that they thought that it was catchy. Yeah, that's doing what comes naturally. Now, like the thief, the defendant in the last example, this song lyric, too, views what is natural really as opposed to morality. Except that this time we're talking, with the Bloodhound Gang, we're talking about the moral laws of sex, not the moral laws of property. Next slide, please. The premise of both the thief and the Bloodhound Gang is that the proper norms for human life, the rule and measure of human action, is doing what comes naturally. And the funny thing is that Thomas Aquinas actually agrees. Doing what comes naturally is the rule and measure of human action. His term, as I said before, is natural inclination. So there's a grain of truth in what the thief and the Bloodhound Gang believe. No error really can be plausible. No error can be swallowed, can be destructive, can be damaging, unless there is some grain of truth that it takes and distorts. But there is distortion. Next slide, please. The big error in what the thief and the Bloodhound Gang believe is this. When St. Thomas says that the natural law is based on our natural inclinations, he doesn't mean that it's based on whatever we happen to desire, but that it's based on what is naturally good for us, good for creatures of our kind, for beings that have a human sort of nature. Some desires are really crazy. We're designed and equipped to seek what is naturally good for us, but we might happen to desire because of an abuse of our rationality, all sorts of things that aren't naturally good for us. If St. Thomas is right about doing what comes naturally, then his point sheds a different light, doesn't it? On the statements by the thief and by the Bloodhound Gang. They think that they are doing what comes naturally, but Thomas Aquinas would really have to say they're living unnaturally. In other words, what they propose is contrary to human nature in the sense that, although they maybe desire these things, the way that they live is frustrating their natural inclinations. It is cutting against the grain of our natural design. It thwarts what is naturally good for us. It prevents our flourishing in all of our dimensions. Next, please. Well, what natural inclinations do we have then? St. Thomas doesn't even try to list our natural inclinations exhaustively, but he does classify them. In your reading, in question 94, Article 2, he gives us a three-part classification. First, I don't say more important, come all of the inclinations pertaining to self-preservation. Now, actually, all beings are inclined to self-preservation, but the crucial thing to understand here is that they're not all inclined to it in the same way. A tomato plant automatically does what is necessary to preserve itself. For example, its roots suck up water and nutrition from the soil. A dog is at a higher level because it's guided instinctually to preserve itself. It eats when it's hungry. A human being is at a higher level still because it's guided rationally to preserve itself. It can think to itself, I'd like another slice of cake, but it wouldn't be good for me. The preservation of his being also doesn't just mean living to him. The human being with his rational faculties asks, what kind of life is living about. What does it mean to live well? I don't want to just stay alive, and this requires the guidance of reason. Next, please. Now, the plants, animals, and humans share an inclination, sure, for the sake of preservation to get rid of, for example, irritants. This is just an example. But to further illustrate the difference, the plant follows it automatically, for example, by oozing sticky sap where an insect has broken its surface, and that gums up the insect and makes it flow away. You can see that this may not always work. The animal follows the inclination to preservation instinctually. Whenever it itches, it scratches. This might not always work either, by the way. After all, the function of scratching isn't just to get rid of the itch, is it? It's to remove the irritant that causes the itch. Dogs, unfortunately, led only by their instinct, don't understand this. They scratch even when scratching isn't functional. My son-in-law's dog has to wear a cone when his allergies act up, because otherwise he'll scratch all of his hair out. That's not actually a picture of him, but it's a picture of a dog that looks just like him. Next, please. By contrast, although we human beings itch too, we act on our inclination to remove the irritant rationally. When scratching wouldn't remove the irritant, well, you can resist the urge. You can say, this is not a good time to scratch. You can recognize the need to remove the irritant even if it doesn't make you itch. Oh, I see, I have to do something about that. You can recognize that the inclination to remove irritants also serves a greater purpose of preservation. You can think about it rationally. If the removing an irritating bit of scab might cause bleeding and infection, you don't remove it. Next, please. The second in order come all of the inclinations, according to Thomas Aquinas, pertaining to, quote, sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. Everything related to the use of the sexual powers according to their natural purpose. But wait, what is their natural purpose? The bloodhound gang, most of my students would say, why, their purpose is pleasure. Well, that doesn't really work. The purpose of every voluntary power is pleasurable. Eating is pleasurable. Taking a deep breath is pleasurable. Stretching my muscles by reaching out my arm or going like this in the morning is pleasurable. Now, that doesn't show that the purpose of all of those things is pleasure. It only shows that possibly the motive of my doing them on any given instance might be pleasure. The purpose of eating, it is pleasurable. That may be why I eat that chocolate bar, but its purpose, its inbuilt function is nutrition. Any way of seeking the pleasure of eating that undermines that purpose, for example, eating, purging, and then returning to the table for another course, is disordered. Just as the purpose of the eating or ingestive powers is nutrition, so the purpose of the sexual powers is procreation, along with the loving unity of the procreative partners, which for humans is part of the package. Next, please. The procreative inclination is more than an inclination to reproduce, by the way. You might think procreation is just a sort of an old-fashioned word for reproduction. Well, no, it means more than that. Procreation includes whatever is involved in raising the children well, building loving unity between the spouses, fostering the well-being of the family. Animals have procreative inclinations too, but theirs work differently than ours. For them, doing what comes naturally does mean following merely the promptings of instinctual desire concerning the sexual powers. For us, it means following the guidance of reason about these promptings, following them in the right way as we can discern, at the right time and with the right person, who is one's spouse. Sometimes it may even require, of course, saying no to them. Next. Strictly speaking, you know, it's not even possible for a human being to live like an animal. We criticize some people who are acting inappropriately for living like animals, but technically they're really not living like an animal because they're thinking about it. I might say, hey, you know, I don't care about all this rationality business. I just want what's coming to me. I'm going to live like an animal. He's thinking about it. An animal doesn't think about it. Even in order to imitate an animal, the animal isn't imitating. This imitating is something that only the rational being can do in that way. Next, please. Now, we've seen that human beings follow the first and second inclinations not automatically, like plants, or instinctively, like animals, but rationally. Well, considering that we are rational beings, it's not surprising that third in order come all of the inclinations pertaining to rationality itself that are intrinsic to rationality. Plants and animals do not have these inclinations at all. They are a human privilege, or perhaps I should say a privilege of rational beings. The most well-known example of which for us, we don't know much about the angels, is human beings. Next, please. The first branch, I'm going to complicate this further. The first branch of this third family of inclinations, the rational inclinations, includes everything pertaining to seeking the truth, especially St. Thomas says, especially the truth about God. That's the most important truth. This makes sense, as the purpose of eyes is to see, so the purpose of the mind is to deliberate about what to do and to attain knowledge about what is. Next, please. The second, unexpectedly, though, Thomas Aquinas indicates that this third branch, that this third family of inclinations has a second branch too. He says another rational inclination is everything pertaining to living in society. You know, when I first began to study these things, that always puzzled me. I thought, why is he saying that this is a rational inclination? Don't we share this with the animals? You know, the cows live in herds. There are many social animals. Well, it's not the same thing. There are some animals that are naturally social in a sub-rational way, but human society is a radically different thing than the so-called society of cows or the fact that fish swim in schools. For human society is ordered to the rational and spiritual goods about which creatures like cows or fish know nothing. Let me read to you a passage. This is from your readings. It's a critically important one. Question 94, Article 4. The natural law, as to general principles, is the same for all, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge. But as to certain matters of detail, which are conclusions, as it were, of these general principles, Thomas says, it is the same for all in the majority of cases, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge, yet in some few cases it may fail. Thus, formerly, his example, theft, although it is expressly contrary to the natural law, was not considered wrong among the Germans, as Julius Caesar relates. He's referring to, as he indicates, to Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, section 6. Now, this passage needs to be unpacked. And so let's take it one chunk at a time. He says, the natural law as to its general principles, what I call the foundational principles, the basics, is the same for all, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge. What does that mean? Well, a good example might be the Golden Rule. To say that the general principles are the same for all as to rectitude means that they're right for everyone. They have rectitude for everyone. To say that they're the same for all as to knowledge means that at some level they are known to everyone. Everyone has knowledge of them. This knowledge may very well be latent knowledge. You may not have ever consciously thought about it. He speaks, when he's talking about synderesis, he speaks of synderesis as a habit of having actual knowledge, not as the actual knowledge. We have a tendency to have this in our mind, in the forefront of our minds, but it may not always be there. Even so, if someone calls it to your attention, your reaction is something like, well, somehow I knew that all along. Next, please. The more detailed conclusions of the general principles, he says, are the same for all in the majority of cases, but now and then they may fail in either of the two ways. They may fail as to rectitude, meaning that they may not be right, or they may fail as to knowledge, meaning that they may not be known. For example, one of the detailed corollaries of the principle, thou shalt not steal, is that if somebody asks me, let's say, to give back his property that he's temporarily entrusted to me, I ought to return it. Okay, that's a detailed corollary. Now, you can see that perhaps not everybody knows that. It's a little bit further from the basic principle, and we can even think of cases where it doesn't hold true. It fails as to rectitude. For example, the property that someone has entrusted to me is his shotgun or his rifle, and he's gone away for a couple of days. At the time when he comes banging on my door and demands it back, he's in a murderous rage. The principle, give back to somebody the property that he's entrusted to you when he demands it, fails as to rectitude in a case like this. Next, please. The general principles, though, that's one of the detailed corollaries, but even so, the general principles include quite a bit. As Thomas Aquinas says a little bit later, not in your readings, but it's still in what is called the Treatise on Law. It's in question 100, Article 1. For there are certain things which the natural reason of every man of its own accord and at once judges to be done or not to be done. And he gives examples. Honor your father and mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. A question should be arising in your minds there. And these belong to the law of nature, absolutely. Now, but the general principles don't include all the details. He goes on to say there are certain things which, after a more careful consideration, wise men deem obligatory. Such belong to the law of nature, yet so that they have to be inculcated. Such the wiser teaching the less wise, like rise up before the hoary head, honor the person of the aged man, and the like. Now, you may think, next please, that there is a contradiction here. In the passage that I just now quoted, Thomas Aquinas says that theft, the wrong of theft, is one of the things that the natural reason of every man of its own accord and at once knows, judges to be wrong. But then what do we make of that still earlier statement that I quoted to you about the ancient Germans in question 94, Article 4? Remember? He had said that formerly theft, although it is expressly contrary to the natural law, was not considered wrong among the Germans, as Julius Caesar relates. So did the ancient Germans know that theft was wrong? He seems to say here that they didn't. Or did they know that theft was wrong, because he seems to say that the reason of every man immediately and of its own accord knows that. Next, please. Well, the ancient Germans did know that theft was wrong. Moreover, St. Thomas knows that they knew. We know that they knew, and we know that St. Thomas knows that they knew. Why? Because, looking a little further, in the very same chapter from Julius Caesar's book Gallic Wars that St. Thomas is citing, Caesar explicitly says, and Thomas must have read this, that when the ancient Germans sacrificed men to their gods, they practiced human sacrifice, they preferred to sacrifice thieves and other criminals. Isn't that interesting? When they could find them. In other words, because they thought they were guilty and deserving of death. They understood that theft is wrong. So it seems that St. Thomas couldn't mean that the Germans didn't even know the general precept, thou shalt not steal. Then what does he mean when he seems to say that? Next, please. Well, scholars disagree about the answer to the solution to this puzzle, but I'll tell you what I think, and what I think he believes here is what I think to be true also. My view is that when St. Thomas says the ancient Germans didn't know that theft was wrong, he doesn't mean they didn't know the principle, but that they didn't apply the principle correctly. You know, they were raiding from other tribes all the time. It isn't that they didn't know that it was wrong to steal, but they didn't recognize that as stealing. They knew the precept, thou shalt not steal, but they didn't admit to themselves that what they were doing was a violation of that precept. I think that he's right. That sort of thing is very common in human life.
No, you want I should steal.
Oh, no, it's not stealing.
Yeah, it's not stealing. How many times have you heard that? It's not cheating. I'm sure if I thought about it and had more time, I'd know the answer to that question on the test. To put the matter another way, there was a mismatch between two levels of conscience here. Between their deep moral knowledge, which St. Thomas calls synderesis, and the application of this knowledge, the active application, which he calls conscientia. The immensely important distinction between deep knowledge and surface conscience has been lost by modern psychology. As I mentioned before, our textbooks naively assume that conscience is just one thing and that it's all pumped in from the outside. He doesn't agree. Next, please. The same thing that happened to the precept of theft in the case of the Germans happens with other precepts too. Take the precept against murder. When cannibals justified eating people of other tribes, when Nazis justified gassing the Jews, when people are of our own time and place justify killing unborn children, they aren't really unaware that it's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life. What they try to say is that, oh, things like this, that the innocent people whose lives that they're taking aren't really human. Or that they aren't really, they don't really have a life, they're not really living, or even that they aren't really innocent. There is a feminist lawyer who published, a law school professor who published a book arguing that the reason abortion is okay is that even though it's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life, and even though the unborn child is human, well, she doesn't want to call it a child, she says that's a metaphor, but even though the fetus, she says, is human and is alive, she says the fetus is not innocent, because it's an aggressive intruder in the woman's womb and made her pregnant against her will. She speaks of this in connection with intrusion. She uses the language of intrusion. Speaks of our attitude toward abortion as comparable to telling a woman that when a rape is taking place that we should tell her just wait till it's all over. Now, by the way, I think, Thomas Aquinas doesn't say this, but I believe this to be true, that the behavior of people who make such excuses always betrays symptoms of the suppression of moral knowledge. They know better than they admit to themselves that they know. Next, please. The natural law cannot be changed in the important sense that general principles like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, honor your mother and father, could never stop being true, could never stop being binding upon us. In that sense, natural law is utterly immutable. But concerning, you will remember this from your reading, and it might have perplexed you, concerning the detailed precepts, Thomas Aquinas explains in question 94, Article 5, that the natural law actually can be changed, funny language, in two ways. He says by addition and by subtraction. What on earth does he mean? The language that he uses here is a trifle strange to our ears, but the reasoning is actually pretty commonsensical, and I think it's not very hard to see what he means. Next, please. Here are a couple of examples. The natural law says care for the safety of your neighbor, but it doesn't tell me how to do it. Suppose, on the other hand, that we're talking about caring for the safety of my neighbor on the roadway. Well, okay, I'm trying to care for the safety of my neighbor, and so are my neighbors, but we're having a lot of collisions. And the legislature settles the question of how to ensure safety by enacting a law saying to everyone, drive on the left. Now, a new moral obligation has been generated, not out of nothing. There was a prior norm, have care for the safety of your neighbor, but it has been further specified in greater detail. The legislature could have specified it in a different way and said drive on the other side of the road, but it didn't. It said drive on this side of the road. Well, okay. But either way, that has now become obligatory. Something has been added. Something has become obligatory that wasn't obligatory before. That's what he means by adding to the natural law. Making promises is another example of this. The natural law says keep your promises, but it doesn't tell me what promises to make. Suppose I promise to loan my friend $5. The natural law tells me loan him $5. But it didn't tell me that before I made the promise. In a way, again, something has been added. Notice that in each case, the thing that's been added adds detail or specification to a more general norm that was already binding. And this is one of the most distinctive things about human legislation. Not out of nowhere, but on the basis of the natural law, legitimate authority can generate a new binding moral obligation when it enacts a law. Now, next, please. The natural law says that under normal circumstances, what about subtraction? That's what this is about. I should give back your property when you ask for it. Here's another I used this example before, but here's another variation. At the moment that you ask for your car keys, the circumstances aren't normal. You're drunk. You know, you've been off in the other part of the restaurant at the bar. What Thomas Aquinas calls an obstacle, quote unquote, your drunkenness, causes a norm that is usually right, giving back your property at the time that you demand it. Not to be right in this case. Something in that sense has been subtracted. This is another way of saying that there are exceptions to some of the detailed conclusions of the natural law. However, there are no exceptions, and this is the more important point, to the general principles of the natural law, like never steal, be faithful to your spouse, and so forth. Next, please. Well, you know, if you can be ignorant, not of the general principles, but of the detailed principles, how ignorant can you be? And can you get it wrong somehow, even about the general principles? Let's think about it. Is it possible for the knowledge of the natural law to be destroyed? For it to just be wiped clean out of your conscience, or as Thomas Aquinas says, blotted out from the heart? Thomas Aquinas says in question 96, Article 6, that depends on which principles that we're talking about. The general principles cannot be blotted out from the heart of man. To put it another way, you know, I've said this, I'll say it again, there are some moral basics that a person with a normal adult mind can't not know. Although even there, a strong desire or a passion may keep a person from applying a general principle correctly to the act that he's committing. I've talked about excuses. I know it's wrong to cheat, but looking at the answer key isn't cheating because I know I could pass the test if only I had time to study. And isn't that what a test is for? Next, please. As to the detailed conclusions of the natural law, on the other hand, it's not just a matter that they can't be blotted out of the heart, but you can apply them incorrectly. Thomas Aquinas actually does say that these can be blotted out of the heart. They can be wiped clean out of your mind or never develop in the first place. A person may, for instance, get to the point that he can no longer recognize certain acts as wrong, even though what's wrong with them ought to be plain to us, ought to be plain to him. This can happen, he says, through vicious custom, that everybody's doing it, through corrupt habit, I've gotten used to it, or through evil persuasion, I'm taken in by a depraved ideology. For example, a salesman may tell himself that kickbacks are just a cost of doing business. Or a political activist might say electoral fraud is just, quote, something you have to do. Next, please. We see then that even though there is no way to wipe away, to wipe out what St. Paul calls the law written on the heart, we are all too well equipped with ways to pretend that it isn't there, to put our hands over it, to try to overwrite it with a big felt marker, and try to ignore or to try to rub it out even if we can't really do it, or to avert our eyes and look elsewhere. This is all too human, all too easy, and it is the shape of the present moral crisis. Not that conscience is growing weaker, but that conscience does not prevent us from doing these things. And unfortunately, when we do these things, conscience has its revenge. Consider, for example, abortion. You can't not know that it's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life, except, as I've indicated, we can lie to ourselves saying, well, it isn't deliberate, it isn't a taking, they're making me do it, the baby isn't alive, it's just a clump of cells. We can even pretend that wrong is something other than what must not be done. Next, please. The modernist project is, in the most general sense, I think, is to seek technical solutions. Sometimes chemical, like penicillin, sometimes political engineering. Technical solutions to what are really moral evils. Naively, we moderns consider it unrealistic to say that we need to develop virtue. More realistic, not to seek to build virtue, instead saying the lower foundation is the stronger, seeking to, quote T.S. Eliot, seeking to contrive, quote, systems so perfect that no one has to be good. The folly of this approach, I think, is much the same whether technical perfection is sought in an all-provident government or in a supposedly value-free market. In whatever form it presents itself, the classical natural law tradition spurns this opium dream. It says that although our institutions and our technologies, of course, make a difference, it can make things easier or harder. Fundamentally, we need a well-formed conscience, and we need the disciplined cultivation of virtue in accordance with the natural law. Thank you.